Hi everyone, thanks for being here. I'm Akers. If you look at most organizations today, there's no shortage of tools, no shortage of frameworks, but that hasn't really made things easier. What's missing isn't technology, it's how we make decisions. So in this session, let's start with something familiar, decisions. Every cybersecurity investment comes with a trade-off. If we spend here, we're not investing somewhere else. Maybe that means less for growth, less for innovations, or less for investing in people. So the question isn't whether security matters. The real question is how do we decide where to spend and how much is enough. That's what I call it. Cybersecurity as capital allocation. It's a mindset shift, treating security as an investment decision, not just another operational headache. In this session, I'd like to share why Cyber Risk Quantification, or CRQ, is becoming so critical, especially here in Asia, and more importantly, how it helps us make better choices. So, I'll show you a practical way to look at risk, a way to find a common language, so security, finance, and the board can actually understand each other without missing the point. Before we go further, let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Akers. Most of my work sits between risk, finance, and technology. I currently serve as the Secretary General of the Taiwan Risk Governance and Measurement Association, and I'm also co-founder of the FAIR Institute Taiwan chapter. Over the years, I've picked up certifications like CFE, CISA, and OpenFair. I also completed a PhD because I was looking for a more rigorous way to understand risk. But that's not what changed my perspective. It's an experience of working inside large organizations where teams face budget limits and regulatory pressure. And in that environment, you quickly realize something. We don't really need more general theories. We need a common language. That's why I'm so interested in cyber risk quantification, not as a technical exercise, but as a practical way to connect security work with business decisions. And that's a perspective I'd like to share with you. Let's go back for a moment. Think about the financial world just before 2008. Everything appeared structured and under control. Ratings were high, reports looked positive, and the models looked quite advanced. Because everything seemed calm, people started to believe something dangerous. Banks trusted the ratings, investors trusted the numbers, and as long as the tower didn't move, everyone assumed the risk were under control. But as we now know, that stability was fragile, like a Jenga tower built on weak assumptions. Behind those triple labels were weak loans and complex structures that very few people truly understood. People were busy checking compliance boxes, but not looking at the real exposure. And we all know how that story ended. When that tower finally collapsed, it was already too late to react. So why am I bringing this here? Because today, I see a very similar patterns in our own industries. We have our own triple ratings, we call them certifications, maturity models, nice looking dashboards. On paper, a lot of organizations look mature, they look compliant. But looking good on paper doesn't mean we're actually resilient. Once again, we start to think stability means safety. And that's precisely what makes today's situation so dangerous. But here's an interesting part. In every major crisis, there's always a small group who doesn't simply follow a crowd. Before the 2008 collapse, while everyone else trusted the AAA ratings, a few investors started looking deeper. They stopped trusting the labels and started asking different questions. They focused on three things. First, impact. They didn't settle for words like high or critical. At some point, it comes down to one question. If this goes wrong, how much could we lose? Length, likelihood. Not general statistics, not industry averages. How likely is this scenario to happen? And finally, resilience. Could I survive a hit if the worst case scenario happened? And notice the shift here. They weren't asking about compliance or rating animals. The questions become simpler. How much could this cost us? How likely is it? These are not technical problems, they're business decisions. And because they ask better questions, they make better decisions. This is the mindset behind cyber risk quantification. It's about moving away from checklists and moving toward clear decisions. Now, let's bring this back to Asia. When we look at the data, one number really stands out, 12%. Take a second to think about that. In our region, only about 1 in 10 organizations actually quantify cyber risk, which means most of them don't. And to be clear, people do care about security. It's more about how decisions are typically made in many organizations here. First, there is an experience-driven culture. We often trust the judgment and intuitions of leaders who have seen many situations before, and that experience is valuable. But today's cyber environment changes fast, and intuition alone is no longer enough. Second, there's the weight of hierarchy and consensus. Important decisions often go through many layers. Everyone wants alignment, everyone wants to play safe, and sometimes the conversations become slow and move away from the actual risk itself. And third, we face structural challenges. Data is often siloed. IT, security, and finance don't always speak the same language, and there's rarely a shared metric that brings it all together. So, what happens in practice? Decisions are still made, and budgets are still spent, but often based on perceptions or past habits. This is what I call the silent decision. Because every year, organizations make major cybersecurity investments, but they don't really know which risk they are actually reducing. So, while many organizations still rely heavily on experience and intuition, it helps to look at the wider market, and especially at insurers. After all, they are the ones who pay when things go wrong, and they see things very differently. They are actually using data and modeling to do this. They analyze those data, they model scenarios, and they price risk very precisely. And this is creating a real shift in Asia. As you can see on this slide, cyber claims have increased by around 50%. But here's the part that stands out. Insurance rates are actually going down. At first, this feels a bit unusual. More losses, but lower prices. But there's the reality. This isn't a price cut, it's a repricing. The market is becoming far more selective. If you have strong controls and clear risk data, and the market rewards you, you get better terms and lower premiums. But when visibility is limited, the market prices that uncertainty differently. You may see higher deductibles, more exclusions. Many organizations only realize this at renewal. By then, the market is already using data to price risk, and intuition alone simply isn't enough. It starts to become a real strategy risk, and this means something important. Cybersecurity is no longer just a technical issue for IT. It has become a core business challenge. So, we've looked at the market, but what does it look like in real life? At the end of the day, almost every security conversation in the ballroom hits the same wall, and that wall called budget. The reality is, no organization has unlimited resources. If you look at the trend here in Taiwan, budgets have grown. You can see the numbers on the slide, but they don't quite match the scale of today's threats. Even looking toward 2026, many teams are still working with budgets that only cover parts of their actual risk exposure. And this puts CISOs and security leaders in a very difficult positions. And in many cases, these investment decisions are not made from clear data. And here is a danger. A limited budget doesn't just mean less security. It often ends up creating unbalanced security. So, what's actually missing here? Now, think about what happens when security reports reach your board. So, what do they actually see? Maturity scores, heat maps, those familiar red, yellow, and green dots. But those colors really answer the question business leaders really care about. Without a decision-rating matrix, the conversation stays stuck in technical details. And we all know what happened next. When the conversation stays technical, budget decisions become political. That's the real gap. So in many cases, this isn't really a technical problem. It's more about language problems. Security speaks in controls, the bowl speaks in capital. So let's get to the key points. What actually changes when CRQ enters the conversation? First, and most importantly, we translate risk into the language of money. We move beyond red, yellow, and greens, beyond high, medium, and low. Instead, we talk about financial exposure. And once cyber is in financial terms, we can now talk about it like any other business risk. Second, CRQ makes trade-off visible. And this changes the decision process. Instead of what feels urgent, we can be more precise. Third, CRQ allows us to compare investment fairly. Security projects are not just technical costs. They are capital allocation decisions just like any other investment. And in practice, CRQ doesn't just give us numbers. What it really gives us is a common language, a bridge that allows security, finance, and the board to sit at the same table and talk about the same things in the same way. To simplify this, let's think about it as two different ways of seeing risk. On the left, we have what I call the perception-based world. This is where many organizations operate today. We use red, yellow, green dashboards. We follow checklists. We focus strongly on compliance. And in this world, the audit reports often drive the conversation. And to be fair, there's nothing wrong with this approach. It gives structure, it gives accountability. But as we've seen, it doesn't always give us the financial clarity needed for difficult decisions. Now look at the right side, the exposure basis approach. Here, we move away from colors and toward capital. Risk is expressed in financial terms. We turn to understand how much risk is reduced for each dollar spent. If we look at it from a perception perspective, the question is simple. Are we compliant? But if we look at it from an exposure perspective, it becomes a different question. Are we economically resilient? One focuses on the past, the other focuses on the future. At this point, people tend to sink the sand. This sounds great, but is it going to be complex? Does it take years and a huge budget? The short answer is no. You don't need a big bang transformation. You don't need to rebuild your entire framework. What I usually tell my teams is very simple. Just start small. I usually think of it in a very simple way. First, choose one scenario. Don't try to model everything. Maybe a ransomware attack lasts sub-operation for 3 days. Something everyone can picture easily. Second, focus on one decision. Choose an investment already being discussed. And third, bring it into one forum. Take an insight into a real meeting and simply observe how the conversation changes. So, start small, one scenario, one decision. No need for massive overhaul, just a real conversation with a bit more clarity. And once leadership sees how they shift the discussion into a business decision, the next step comes quite naturally. If there's one thing I hope you remember from this session, cyber risk quantification isn't really about math, not about complex models, not about software. At its core, it's about conversations. And when we move from intuition to evidence, leaders gain something they often struggle to find: competence. Not because risk disappears, but because uncertainty becomes something measurable and manageable. That's a shift worth considering, moving from compliance to actually understanding exposure, from controls to thinking about how we allocate resources, and maybe most importantly, moving from intuition to something we can support with evidence. Before we finish, I'd like to leave you with one final thought. We all know cybersecurity isn't about preventing every single attack. So the real question isn't how we stop the inevitable. The real question is this: are we stable before the impact arrives? Because when a major incident happens, it's already too late to start doing the math, too late to justify budgets, and definitely too late to explain risk exposure. Qualifications isn't a crystal ball. It's not about predicting the future. It's about preparations. It allows an organization to understand the financial shock before it actually happens. It allows us to see the fragile blocks in the tower while there is still time to act. So maybe it's not about whether we can afford to implement CRQ. The real question is simple. Can we afford not to quantify it? Thank you for spending this time with me. I hope this session gives you a slightly different way to look at cyber risk. If any of these ideas resonate with you, or if you are exploring how to bring quantified thinking into your own organizations, please feel free to connect with me. Thank you and look forward to continue the conversation.